In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here.
This is not a subtle car. This is a car that says, I'm going somewhere, and you better not be in my way. I don't really know who within the Ford Motor Company made the decision that it ought to go to the museum, but clearly somebody high up said, we don't want to throw this thing away.
Something that helped capture the public imagination about the turbine car was the fact that Chrysler loaned them free of charge to preferred customers. A couple of dozen ended up in the hands of really, really lucky drivers.
Reintroducing the 1953 Ford X100 and the 1963 Chrysler Turbine. (1953). Molecular biologists James Watson and Francis Crick reveal the molecular structure of DNA. New Zealander Edmund Hillary and the Nepalese Sherpa Tenzing Norgay are the first to reach the summit of Mount Everest. It's an era of inspiration, discovery, and limitless possibility. The perfect time for Ford Motor Company to flex its innovative muscle. This is the 1953 Ford X100.
This was Ford's 50th anniversary year. So they're celebrating this long history, this rich history that Ford Motor Company has. But they're also saying, we got another 50 years in front of us, and this is the future. We're not just looking backwards, we're looking forward. This is what you're going to be able to drive.
Chief stylists Elwood Engel and Joe Oros wanted to celebrate Ford's Big 5-0 with a bang, and they did not disappoint. They designed a concept car with over 50 brand new innovations, all in one automobile.
This car is full of gadgets and interesting ideas. The sun visors are actually tinted, but you can see through them. This array of switches and levers over here is designed to look like the throttles on a multi-engine aircraft. So it's picking up on this aircraft theme. The automatic transmission selector is actually one of those levers. Another couple of those levers operate jacks, one for the front, one for the rear of the car. So it carries its own jack if you have to change a tire. There are switches along the console here that control the tilt on the seats. You got power seats, which was really unusual in 1953. You got heated seats, so you can control the temperature of the seats. Again, really futuristic in 1953. The windows are power windows. The door locks are push-button door locks. This car actually came with an electric shaver that you could drive along and shave yourself. But they were pushing the envelope on this car. And then the piece de resistance, a telephone in your car. Hello?
The public wanted to see the future. Brimming with ultra-modern gadgets galore, the Ford X100 answered the call. And when it came to space-age design, there were certainly no hang-ups.
One of the big influences on auto styling in the 1950s was airplanes, especially jet airplanes. They always have some large air intake on the front. That's what these bulges are mimicking, is the air intake on a jet plane. And on the rear of this car is a big red taillight, and it's mimicking the exhaust on a jet. And what they're saying is, visually, they're saying, drive this car and you'll be like a fighter pilot. You don't really want to see this in your rearview mirror. It's like if you're too slow, this thing's just going to suck you in and spit you out the tail end.
The 1953 Ford X100 had toys to thrill with looks to kill. It looked like it drove straight out of the world of science fiction. But was this car too far-fetched for the real world? In 1953, Ford Motor Company celebrated its 50th anniversary with the release of the X100 concept car. It had 50 new innovations. It had ultra-modern looks. But in the world of concept cars, futuristic design doesn't guarantee a future in mass production.
A concept car like this is never intended to be mass-produced. Aspects of this car will end up in production, but nobody ever intended the whole car to be available to the public for sale. Other car companies were producing concept cars at the time. Chrysler was working with Ghia, who was an Italian bodybuilding company, and they had a whole series of cars that were actually a little bit milder than this, a little bit closer to actual production cars. But this was pretty wild, and not all concepts work out in practice. All the gadgets on this car would soon begin to fail. One of the first things you notice when you try to get into this car is this huge dog leg here that results from the wraparound windshield. This is what happens. The wraparound windshield looks very cool, but it also makes getting in and out of the car rather difficult. It's very easy to whack your knee on this thing. That was a characteristic of 50s cars that had these wraparound windshields, and it's one reason that we don't have wraparound windshields anymore in our cars.
The Ford X100 had one purpose: to inspire and fascinate the car-buying public. But it also inspired the very company that created it. It was never destined for mass production, but this space-age machine found its own unique way of traveling into the future.
If you look at the rear of this car, the rear end treatment really is very similar to what showed up in 1961 on the Thunderbird. In fact, from about here back, the whole shape of this car is reminiscent of that 1961 Thunderbird. There's these great hooded headlights that show up in the next few years on Lincolns and Mercurys, and in a slightly different form on Fords.
A lot of the X100's innovations lived on. But not every concept car lives on with what it inspires.
By 1958, this car had outlived its usefulness as a predictor of the future, especially visually, because elements of the car were already appearing on production cars. But fortunately, they didn't want to throw it away. They had a lot invested in this, and this, unlike a lot of concept cars, actually ran. So, in keeping with their sense of history and a celebration of their 50th anniversary, they gave it to Henry Ford Museum in 1958. The 1950s were probably the great golden era for concept cars. And in part, it was because it was an optimistic era. The future was always going to be better. The future was always going to be cooler than today. Over the years, for a whole lot of reasons, some of that optimism has been squeezed out of us. And I kind of doubt that sort of innocent enthusiasm that we all felt for cars like this is ever going to come back. But that sense of unlimited possibilities and kind of unlimited optimism about the future has been tempered by sad reality. I don't really know who within the Ford Motor Company made the decision that it ought to go to the museum, but clearly somebody high up said, we don't want to throw this thing away. And Henry Ford Museum is here, would they like to have it? And of course we said, absolutely, we'd love to have it. And so fortunately, over 50 years after that, we've still got the car.
In 1963, a decade had passed since GM's first turbine-powered concept car. But the time had come for Chrysler to harness turbine power in a whole new way.
Something that helped capture the public imagination about the turbine car was the fact that Chrysler loaned them free of charge to preferred customers. A couple of dozen ended up in the hands of really, really lucky drivers.
In 1963, the Learjet 23 prototype, the first Learjet ever built, takes to the skies and revolutionizes the business transport world. At Cape Canaveral, NASA successfully launches the SYNCOM-2, the first geosynchronous communications satellite. Telephone and television signals are transmitted via satellite for the first time ever. Americans are finding new ways to move themselves and their media faster and farther than ever before. And the automotive industry is right in step. Chrysler designed a fleet of revolutionary concept cars, and they promoted them in a completely revolutionary way. Not only did people get a chance to look at these cars, they actually got to drive them. This is the 1963 Chrysler Turbine.
Something that helped capture the public imagination about the turbine car was the fact that Chrysler loaned them free of charge to preferred customers over about a 2-year period. Some people say they built 50, some sources say 55, but a couple of dozen ended up in the hands of really, really lucky drivers.
The Chrysler Turbine wasn't the first concept car with a turbine engine, but it was different from those before it. This turbine concept car was designed specifically to be driven by everyday drivers, even though it was far from an everyday car.
What's unique and interesting about this car is just about everything, starting with the drivetrain. First of all, it's turbine power. And all a turbine engine is exploding gases over a kind of fan, and the explosive force manages to spin that fan, and you have a nice delivery of smooth power. The car, it can run on anything. It can run on gasoline, of course. It could run on diesel. It could run on kerosene. It could run on JP4. It could run on liquor. It could run on perfume. Anything alcoholic, you could run the turbine car on.
Driving these cars was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, if you were lucky enough to get behind the wheel. But even the experience of witnessing them glide down the street was unforgettable.
The public loved seeing these cars. Chrysler got so many unsolicited requests from people volunteering their services as being test drivers. This car embodied everything about the 50s and 60s. It was a turbine car. It was this weird kind of outer space planet power plant that spun around instead of going up and down like a piston engine did. It had a great noise. On the front, it sounded like a vacuum cleaner, like a real low vacuum cleaner. And on the back, it sounded like a dryer vent. Like when your clothes dryer, if you put the vent up to your ear, it just had this whooshing sound. So quiet, so smooth. It wasn't rumbling because it didn't have pistons going up and down. It didn't have reciprocating motion. It was just one steady whir.
Chrysler's main goal in this audacious experiment was to showcase its refined turbine technology. But you didn't need to pop the hood to appreciate these cars.
This car was about technology, but it was also important for the design of the car to reflect the technology. And when you look at the car, you see all kinds of turbine motifs. You see them on the wheels, you see them around the headlights, you see them on the drive shaft tunnel on the inside. They're everywhere. Chrysler did not want anybody not to know that this had something to do with turbine power.
Building one concept car can be an expensive proposition. Building dozens? Now that's some scary math. In order to achieve that maximum visual impact without breaking the bank, Chrysler had to get creative.
It was designed under the guidance of a fellow by the name of Elwood Engel, who was with Chrysler's styling department at the time, and then built by Ghia of Italy. Chrysler correctly reasoned that it would be a lot less expensive to have the bodies built by a coach builder in Italy who was used to building bodies by hand and then having those bodies come back and then being put on the chassis to have all of that done in Detroit. It would have been prohibitively expensive.
Of all the turbine concept cars from this era, it seemed like the Chrysler Turbine really could have been mass-produced. Then why aren't we all whirring back and forth to work in our turbine cars?
At the end of the customer evaluations, Chrysler took all the cars back, compiled all the material, and decided not to produce the turbine car on any scale at all. The turbine car was very unfamiliar to most people, and they couldn't get used to a lot of its peculiarities. And one of them was the fact that it used a little bit more gas than your average piston engine car. Another one was that it had what they call a flywheel effect. And that meant that when you left your foot off the gas, it wouldn't slow down. When you take your foot off the accelerator on a modern car, a piston engine car, it slows down automatically. But with the turbine car, you had to put on your brake because it would just keep going. They call it the bronze blowtorch because theoretically, it would light the weeds on fire if you stayed idling in one place too long. It got very, very hot. And Most people, again, that was something else people weren't used to.
The 1963 Chrysler Turbine was a revolutionary car presented in a revolutionary way. But in the end, there were just too many glitches to overcome. Even though the bronze blowtorch was unable to light the path to mass production, there was no reason for Chrysler to hang its head.
What Chrysler got out of it was a lot of information, mostly about what not to do. But also Chrysler got out of it a great deal of very favorable public relations. They put these turbine cars in the hands of everyday drivers, and they got this evaluation, and they got to look real sexy on the road. And every time a turbine car pulled into a gas station or went by you on your street, you knew that was something special. And you thought, man, if Chrysler can build cars like that, just think how special my own Chrysler would be. Maybe I should go out and buy one.
In the 1950s and 60s, some concept cars were retained by the car companies that created them. Some were purchased by private collectors. Some ended up in the crusher. Either way, when there's only one of them, it's really not that complicated. But the case of the Chrysler Turbine experiment was a peculiar one. Why? Because there were 50 of them. And unfortunately, dealing with the raw numbers was just the beginning.
Chrysler had a problem because the bodies were built in Italy by Ghia. They were imported, and if Chrysler were to keep them, they would have to have paid import duty on the bodies. So what they did is they ended up destroying them so they could avoid paying the import duty on the Italian-built bodies. And it's heartbreaking to see the film, to see a forklift pierce the glass and lift them up, and then march them over to a pile and then stack them on top of each other. Chrysler retained about 7 or 8, some of which they gave to museums and other institutions, and 3 they kept for their collection. The Chrysler Turbine car is, I think, one of the most fantastic vehicles to come down the road, literally, in a very long time. It embodies a very unique technology. It looks absolutely fantastic, and it's really unusual. It's everything you want in a car. It appeals to all your senses and all your sensibilities.